Hello there, my name is Travis Boley and I'm the Association Manager with the Oregon-California Trails Association, headquartered in Independence, Missouri. And speaking of Independence, today we're in Mount Washington Cemetery on the west side of Independence. And more specifically, we're at the grave of one James Bridger. Bridger, of course, is probably the most celebrated, most renowned, most famous of all the mountain men. His name adorns buildings and roads and mountains and passes and schools and things from here to the West Coast. His name has really almost become synonymous with what was the American West. So who was Jim Bridger? He was born in 1804 in Virginia, and at age 8 his family relocated to St. Louis. And it wasn't long thereafter that he became an orphan. He was apprenticed into the blacksmith trade, but by age 18 he answered a call from William Ashley for the fur trade in 1822. He became one of Ashley's 100, the first 100 mountain men that set out from St. Louis heading west to explore and to trap. By 1830 he had bought a piece of the Rocky Mountain Fur Company, and by 1843 he and Louis Vasquez had purchased Fort Bridger. And then in 1846, probably most infamously, he assured the Donner Party that yes, Lansford Hastings Trail was a fine level road and you can get through relatively unscathed. There is a short 40-mile section of desert you've got to cross. Turns out that was an 80-mile section of desert with no water for several days. So part of the blame for the Donner Party debacle can be laid at the feet of Jim Bridger. You hear about his exploits in the American West, and one of those big tall tales that have been told was that he was with Hugh Glass when he was attacked by the grizzly bear, and Hugh Glass eventually tracks him down and confronts him, but because he's a kid, he more or less leaves him unscathed. But modern day historians call that story into question, and I'll be one to lump that into the maybe category, having read into it a little bit more. That's what really makes this era of exploration difficult to discern fact from fiction, because the records are spotty, sometimes the handwriting's illegible, and Bridger himself was illiterate his entire life. He never learned to read or write, which makes his exploits and his fame really all the more remarkable. When we're talking fact and fiction, there's even a pretty famous inscription just south of Pinedale, Wyoming, supposedly of Jim Bridger, but of course, him being illiterate, how could he have possibly carved his name there? It's almost certainly a fake. But to bring this story back to the Kansas City area, that story's never really been told in too much detail until recently. A new book came out about a year ago. Most books, most histories focus on his time in the West, and really though, Kansas City and this metro area was the West at that time. This was really the beginning of the West. So Bridger spent a huge portion of his life here in the Kansas City area, and especially during his retirement years. But really brings to question, how did this monument arrive here? Well, that story really goes back to 1865. General Granville Dodge, a celebrated Union general who would later become the chief engineer of the Union Pacific Railroad, hired Jim Bridger to help him clear out Sioux, Arapaho, some other tribes, and Bridger was hired on at the age of 61 to be that guide. And I'm going to read a little excerpt from General Dodge's diary. As the Civil War was coming to a close during the summer of 1865, Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho Indians had been raiding the Bozeman Trail and overland mail routes. Dodge ordered a punitive campaign to quell these raids, and he hired Jim Bridger as a guide. Dodge states, "I found him at his home near Kansas City when I took command of that country in January 1865 and placed him as guide of the 11th Ohio Cavalry in its march from Fort Riley to Fort Laramie. Bridger remained with them at Fort Laramie as their guide and took part with them in many encounters they had with the Indians, and his services to them were invaluable." Now, Bridger dies at age 77 in 1881, and at the time, he's farming in what's now South Kansas City. There was a little town down there these days, it was called Dallas back then. Today it's just South Kansas City. If you're familiar at all with the Kansas City area, Interstate 435 and State Line Road, his farm was the very southwest corner of what was then that part of Missouri. So just the farm went right up to the state line of what's now Kansas, and then back a little bit east, and then south from Indian Creek. So he was buried in 1881 along that creek, but his grave was unmarked. And so in 1904, when General Dodge was in New York City for another event, he met a person from Kansas City, and he shared that story about Bridger and how he really wanted to place a nice monument to his old guide and his old friend. So with that, Granville Dodge commissioned this large granite boulder and had it placed here in 1904, which means they had to dig up his bones 23 years down the grave and bring them here. Dodge himself wanted to be here, but illness prevented him from being here, so he sent a proxy in his place to read his letter. One of Bridger's great-granddaughters from one of his 3 Indian wives was also here that day. From the Basalt Journal of December 31st, 1904 comes the headline, "Marks Grave of the Old Pioneer, Scout, and Explorer." And the text reads, a Kansas City Dispatch of December 11th says, "The bones of Jim Bridger, the noted scout, explorer, and Indian fighter who discovered Great Salt Lake and the South Pass and was the first to explore Yellowstone Park, now rest in Mount Washington Cemetery under a massive boulder-like monument which was unveiled today. The discovery of South Pass, which made it possible for the first transcontinental railway, the Union Pacific, won the monument. To General Grenville Dodge, now of New York, then the engineer in charge of the Union Pacific, Bridger revealed the secret of the pass, and Dodge did not forget the service. A year ago, at the unveiling of the monument of General William Tecumseh Sherman in Washington, D.C., General Dodge conveyed to Colonel John B. Colton of Kansas City his desire to erect a monument to Bridger. To Colton was left the task of finding where Bridger was buried and of designing the monument. The unveiling today was the result. The bones of the trapper had been removed a week ago to the cemetery from the grave on the old Bridger farm near Dallas, a little town south of Kansas City. General Dodge had intended to be present at the unveiling exercises and deliver an address, but he was kept in New York by illness. He had prepared his address, however, and this was read by W.N. Jones, who came here from New York for that purpose. The monument is a massive boulder of gray Vermont granite. It weighs 16,000 pounds, is 8 feet high, 4 feet wide, and 2 feet thick. For me personally, one of my favorite stories about Jim Bridger is the Fur Trade Rendezvous of 1840. He had befriended a Scotsman by the name of William Drummond Stewart, who became pretty infatuated with the American West and the fur trade, and in fact funded that rendezvous in 1840 because he missed it so much. In some previous meetings, Bridger had expressed to Stewart his desire to own a suit of armor, so on one of Stewart's many trips back to Great Britain, he procured a suit of armor and brought it to Jim Bridger. And there is a great description in Drummond Stewart's diary about Bridger parading around the rendezvous grounds in this suit of armor. And I could just imagine, out in the wilds of Wyoming, a man, a famous man like Jim Bridger, probably the most famous mountain man, parading around in a suit of armor brought over from England. Has Jim Bridger left his mark on the Kansas City area? Obviously, we have his grave here, but also right here in Independence, we have Bridger Junior High, which my son attended and swam on the swim team there. In Westport, an old neighborhood in Kansas City, the oldest neighborhood in Kansas City. Bridger's store still stands today. It's a bar. In South Kansas City, where his farm was located, there's a historic marker that will show you where that farm was located. It's a very heavily developed residential neighborhood with a hospital and banks and gas stations and things all circling around it, just literally a block from a major interstate. So Bridger's name is all over the Kansas City area, but it's also all over the American West. You know, Bridger Pass and mountains and streams and just geographic landmarks and street names. Bridger is just synonymous with the American West.